Who do you want to be in 6 months? It's an interesting question. I'm not suggesting that you should turn into Benjamin Franklin or Sarah Bernhardt. Really what I'm asking is, what version of yourself do you want to be in 6 months? And the reason I'm asking that is because everything that you are doing right now, what you think about, if you meditate, how much you meditate, the quality of your meditation, what kind of entertainments you seek out, what people you interact with, whether you control your emotions or let your emotions run rampant and control you, all these things affect you in a way that will determine who you will be 6 months from now. And those things are happening right now. Part of the reason that we know this is that our brain, actually our entire central nervous system, is very changeable. It's very plastic. And in fact, when you are talking with another individual, interacting with people, working on a new project, thinking about a new thought, your brain is constantly assessing your need for the future to be able to do that thing better than you're doing it right now. What our studies are showing us is that the brain is so sensitive to this demand of how should I be different? This is your brain asking, how should I be different to help you? Is that within 2 weeks of taking on a new activity, let's say you choose to learn a new language at age 70, you decide to learn a new language, that immediately your brain begins remodeling itself, not just functionally, but structurally, to help you do better with that language. And in fact, you've probably noticed this effect that when you start doing something new, whether it's a new sport, you're learning a new language, maybe you're doing public speaking for the first time, that often there's that initial few weeks where everything seems very difficult. And at about the 2 week mark, if you're working at it regularly, suddenly you find things start becoming easier. Well, if we could look inside a person's brain when they're learning a new language, we'd find it's somewhere around the 2 week mark, their brain has had a chance to change structurally enough to support them in this new activity of speaking a new language. You know, it's a very curious thing. I remember when I was learning languages in college that they used to tell us that, well, you're already 19 years old. You really will never be able to speak this language as well as a native speaker because your brain is already too old. And, you know, pity the poor people that are already in their 30s and 40s. You know, it's just, they have no chance at all. Well, actually, this is one of those things I'm very glad scientifically this was looked at, because basically what they found is that you can learn a new language and speak it beautifully, really in any decade of life, your 50s, your 60s. And in fact, even though people that are younger in their childhood or in their teens, their brains are a little more plastic, a little more changeable. They're able to learn things a little more easily. Often they don't have the discipline, or they haven't trained themselves how to learn efficiently, that in fact, whatever we lost in plasticity, we make up for in efficiency. And so we end up learning languages just fine. And at that 2 week mark is when our brain has actually begun to change enough that it begins to support us in this new activity. So usually what I say to people is, if you're starting a new meditative practice or changing how you're meditating or the length you're meditating, remember the first 2 weeks may feel a little uncomfortable. But if you hang in there with it, your brain will change and cooperate with what you're doing and support you after that. What we know now is that if we go out even further, we go out to the 6 month mark, we see that these changes that have begun to occur in the brain have become extensive and they become much more permanent. And these exact things apply to meditation. And in fact, that's what I would say to you as someone who's about to take up the program of meditation, or to advance what you're doing with your meditation, meditating more, maybe adding a new technique, is remember, what you're doing right this moment is going to bear fruition with changes in your actual neurological brain structure 6 months from now, and those changes will be essentially permanent. You know, it's a curious thing. I remember back in the early 1970s when I was in medical school. It was actually a very good time for me in the sense that I was really questioning what was life about, what's important in life. And I remember I was sitting in our class on neurology, and at that point, the way the neurosciences understood the brain was that basically after about age 18 or 20, your brain stopped developing. And between that point and the end of your life, your brain only degenerated, that there were no changes or improvements that happened. And I remember thinking right when we were being taught that, I thought, my gosh, what a grim prognosis for the average person. Because let's say at age 30, you realize, I don't want to be an alcoholic anymore. Or at age 50, you decide, you know, I'm tired of being a difficult person and being irritable with people. And I'd like to be kinder and sweeter. Basically, what it was saying is that we were all stuck with this neurological boat anchor that we would drag around with us that would interfere with any change we tried to make. It was actually kind of grim when you thought about it. Well, fortunately, in the early 1980s, it was clearly shown in this same field of neuroscience that the brain is not only changeable, it's extremely plastic. It likes to change. And in fact, the way we conceptualize the way the brain functions now, both in terms of change in function and change in structure, is that it's constantly assessing what do we want to do in the future, because it's going to direct itself in terms of its structure and function to assist us in whatever we want to do. So it's a little bit like a sculptor's model that's still just kind of roughed in, and we have to sort of chip away all the dross to get down to the actual true sculpture. And our brain is actually there helping us make these changes. It will assist us. The further we go with a positive change, the more it will assist us in making even more change. And this can be in any aspect of our life. It can be in being kinder to other people. It can be in getting along well with other people. It can be having deeper meditation. It can be a deeper relationship with God. That our brain and central nervous system have been designed, literally, we've been engineered for divinity. We've been engineered to have a deeper relationship with God. And really, God has put us in this body with this tremendous gift awaiting us, but we have to recognize that that's the gift we really want, that the other paltry things around us are really not ultimately what we desire. Once we put our mind on wanting and knowing God, then our brain will cooperate with that process of change. You know, I was very struck early on my time in the spiritual path in the early 70s, because I had just come across this thing that the brain is unchangeable. And very soon after this, I was reading in Yogananda's writings where this was back in the 1920s he was speaking. He said, if you meditate, it will change your brain. And I remember the thought went through my mind at that point, that's got to be right. Because I'd already had the experience. In fact, the way I got on the spiritual path was very interesting how Divine Mother works with us and sort of puts things right in front of us at the proper time to help us in our development, help us in our evolution. I just happened to be working in a research lab. I was working as a researcher. My area of research was figuring out where pollen grains go in your lung when you inhale them. That was my big research project. It was successful. We figured it out. Don't ask me how we did it, but we did. But it just so happened at that very same time, our research lab was doing some of the very first research studies on meditation done in the United States. And some of the research that came out of that, the whole concept of the relaxation response came out of that research. And I remember at the time, one of the things that I was struck with, we had two arms of the study. One part of the study was on people that we were just teaching to meditate, and we could see pre and post learning to meditate, how their brains changed. And by the way, this was the early days of studying meditation. The big controversy at that time was meditation sleep? Were people, when they sat to meditate, were they just sleeping? There were actually proponents that were saying meditation is power napping, essentially. And so that was part of what we were trying to figure out is, did people go to sleep? And I was actually, because I'd never meditated before, I was in the part of the study where they tested you, taught you to meditate, and then they'd retest you. And I'm happy to say I actually fell sound asleep when I was meditating. And they used me as a control of someone who did not meditate, because I was clearly sleeping through the whole half an hour. But you know, a curious thing happened. We actually had a small arm of the study that was looking at veteran meditators. These were people who had meditated for at least 10 years regularly. And once I got beyond sort of the little bit of cultural difference, you know, I was a little bit of a very serious, rational person, sort of wanted to know the basis of everything and didn't have much of a light or humorous part to my personality at that point. If it was there, it was pretty well buried. And I remember we had these people coming in, and they were wearing orange robes, and they smelled like patchouli, and some of them were wearing garland, these giant meditation bead necklaces. And for the first couple of weeks, I thought it was pretty humorous. But after I got to know some of these folks and worked with them, mostly doing very uncomfortable things to them, drawing their blood and sticking little itchy diodes in their scalp. One of the things that I discovered was they were all uniformly very kind people, remarkably so, in a way that was very touching, that you could just feel this is a good person. But the other thing I noticed, they all seemed to have a good sense of humor. And I thought, how curious. Here they're doing something that makes them very nice people. And in fact, if I had asked that question, who do I want to be in 6 months? At that point, there was one point I just had to say, I want to be like them because I like who they are. And clearly they have become something through what they are doing. And how could I be like that? But I was struck with the sense of humor thing, because that seemed to be uniform throughout all of them too. Well, lo and behold, here we are almost 40 years later, and boy, do we know a lot about how the brain changes when you meditate. And in fact, one of the things that's come out of this is that there's an area in the prefrontal lobes of your brain, and just like Master said, just like Yogananda said, that's the prefrontal lobes of the brain that get activated, get accentuated when we meditate. And it's this area of the brain, there's actually a portion of it that's concerned with our sense of humor. And it's not surprising that people often laugh more, smile more, are lighter, actually turn out to have very good sense of humor, where before they were very serious people. Then they haven't lost that serious side. They've just developed this buoyant side, which is really part of who they are. So if I go back to that question, who do you want to be in 6 months? What version of yourself do you want to be in 6 months? I think the real answer is I want to be more like myself, my capital self, my true self, my soul self. And we know now that when someone's meditating, that their brain is going through this tremendous revolution in terms of its structure as well as its function. And what we find, in fact, we know now very specifically some of the ways in which the brain changes. We know that when you're meditating, you're growing new neurons, particularly in the areas of the brain that are beneficial for deeper meditation, primarily in the prefrontal lobes of the brain. We also know that the interconnections between cells in the brain become vastly more complex. And in fact, the interconnections between neurons in an area of the prefrontal lobes, for example, may go from 10 interconnections up to 50 or 100 interconnections in a very brief period of time. And we also know that if your brain doesn't have enough effective function in the area of the brain that's concerned with meditation, that it'll actually begin recruiting nearby cells. It's a little more controversial thing we've found, but it seems to be true that in fact your brain will recruit other cells to help you with your meditation. I mean, it makes it feel much more like it's your brain cell family that's all working for your benefit. And remember, God's designed us this way. We really have been engineered to be successful spiritually. So the concept of the boat anchor, probably good just to let that go. Because in fact, we've been designed to go to the ultimate of our potential reality, which is union with God. Every one of us was designed to be a Christ. Every one of us was designed to be like Yogananda. And we don't even have to wonder now. 60 years ago, we'd sort of wonder, well, how is it possible that meditation would change your brain when science doesn't quite agree with that right now? Well, now we know not only does it change your brain, but we have very good studies showing how meditation changes your brain. And boy, it fits very well with the things that Yogananda was saying almost 80, 100 years ago. It's really quite remarkable to see how well things have tracked what Yogananda said. You know, I was very struck by this when I finally had a chance to read Yogananda's Bhagavad Gita interpretations. And he actually makes the statement in there that the road to God for every individual is through their own nervous system. The road to God for every individual is through their own nervous system. Well, of course, our nervous system has been designed then to cooperate with this process of God realization. And often what I'll say to people, if I'm talking to someone who's an agnostic or an atheist, I'll say, well, of course, this applies equally well to you. If you're concerned in achieving your highest potential, it is going to be through your own nervous system that you do that. And why don't you start meditating anyway? It has many positive effects for you. You know, you'll definitely find that you will feel more intelligent. Your sense of humor will be better. You'll get along better with other people. You'll feel kinder. You'll feel more compassion for other people. You'll be more creative. You'll remember things better. You'll find your ability to learn new information is better. And we know these things from a practical standpoint from the studies on meditation. They've actually shown us that when the prefrontal lobes change, that all these additional attributes begin to show up. Now, what I would probably also say is don't be surprised if you find that what you consider important starts changing as well. And in fact, I'd have to say when I started meditating, it wasn't with the thought of finding God. And in fact, even in my early years on the spiritual path, if I looked at it very honestly, I could say, I would like to be better, but I'm not quite sure what it means to be seeking God. That's actually, I don't know quite what that means. But I know if I meditate now and I prepare myself more, that perhaps I will change where that will have meaning. And that's in fact exactly what happened. And now that concept of meditating to realize God has true meaning and vibrancy in my heart. But when I started, I could not have felt that. In terms of the changes that we see in the brain and central nervous system, I'd like to talk just a little bit more about the science as we understand it. And I did bring my brain model today, and I always think it's good to demonstrate these things. I actually wanted to do a little soliloquy from Hamlet when I picked him up. Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Jyotish. A fellow of infinite jest. He has borne me on his back 1,000 times. I wouldn't have joked like that 30 years ago. Okay. So I'm holding up my brain model here. And when we talk about the prefrontal lobes, it's this area right behind your forehead, essentially. And really, it's the inch and a half of your brain that's right behind your forehead. These are the prefrontal lobes of the brain. There's one area of the brain that's right above your eye sockets. It's called the anterior cingulate gyrus, which is part of the prefrontal lobes. And we're actually finding now this is the area of the prefrontal lobes that may well be associated with your ability to get along well with other people, compassion. We find when people are just doing compassionate acts or thinking compassionate kinds thoughts, it's this area of the frontal lobe that seems to light up on brain imaging. This is something, of course, we couldn't have studied 30 years ago. We didn't have the technology, the ability to do that. So this is the prefrontal lobe area. And I did want to show one area of the brain as well. I'm going to take the outer brain off. And this is the more primitive brain here. I'm holding it by the base of the spinal cord here and holding it up in the same orientation. And these two ram's horn shaped structures, it's called the limbic system, and many things in the brain were named for what they look like because they didn't know what they did. They didn't know what the limbic system did, but they thought it looked kind of like a half moon. So they called it a limbus, or the limbic system. Well, it turns out the limbic system is that's all right. I've dropped it 1,000 times. He's still okay. Uh-oh. I think it got a concussion. With the limbic system, this is a much more primitive area of our brain. And what we find with that is that if your prefrontal lobes aren't really awake and active, your limbic system will function at a level that will keep you alive, keep you functional, help you eat, reproduce. So it's concerned with more primitive emotions when someone is panicked or angry. Usually this is the area of their brain that is activated. Well, it's a very curious thing we found about the limbic system and its relationship with the prefrontal lobes. What we have discovered is the prefrontal lobes actually automatically have an inhibitory effect on the limbic system. And so it's not surprising as you meditate more deeply and your prefrontal lobes become more activated that automatically you find it's easier to control your temper. It's easier to feel less anxious or worried in situations that before you started meditating might have made you feel even a little panicked. You really find more freedom from the drives and instincts of the limbic system because there's this automatic effect. Again, God has designed us this way. So we don't need the safety net of the limbic system as our nervous system grows and develops, particularly when guided by the practice of meditation, which seamlessly does this. One of the things I just think is so elegant about this is we didn't have to figure all this out ourselves, that the rishis and great yogis and saints for thousands of years have had this knowledge, and we can tap into it and practice these techniques. Our nervous system will change in this robust, dramatic, extremely elegant way, and we with it are changed forever. So who are we going to be in 6 months? What version of ourselves are we going to be in 6 months? Well, I hope for all of us that we're more like Christ, and that we're more like Yogananda. In fact, all of us in our heart of hearts, every desire we have for God, every desire that we have for union with the divine will be answered. And we've been given this powerful technique. We've been given a nervous system that is self-transforming, will automatically change with us. And really, if we apply ourselves, in fact, The studies that they've done recently show that your brain will start changing with 15 minutes of meditation a day. In 2 weeks, you can see changes in the brain. In 6 months, those changes are permanent. So if you're someone who's just starting out and meditating for long periods seems daunting, start with 15 minutes. If you're already meditating an hour and a half and you're frustrated because you're not doing more, well, add 15 minutes. Change the time of day you meditate so you can add just a little bit more. And see, as your brain changes, it will make all this transformation much more effortless. Remember, for all of us, our birthright is to be awake in God, to be alive in God. And we're in a fortunate era that we don't even have to guess how this might happen. We can see it on MRI brain scans. So for all of us, I would just say, remember, your brain is helping you. We've been engineered for divinity. We've been engineered for God realization. And take that step now. Don't waste a moment. Work with your meditation, work on your devotion for God, and God will help transform you.